When a black customer was mocked for not looking rich enough, no one realized they'd just humiliated the man who signs their paychecks. Elijah Grant adjusted the rearview mirror of his old Honda Accord, the engine humming low beneath him. He sat in the parking lot of one of his company's most successful dealerships, Grant Motors of Midtown, watching the sleek glass doors where salesmen in tailored suits glided between high-end cars and curated customer smiles. His own reflection in a mirror didn't match the showroom's polish. Today, he wore a plain hoodie, jeans that had seen better days, and scuffed sneakers that made him look more like a college student running errands than the CEO of the entire operation. That was the point. Take a second to subscribe. It really helps. Thanks. Now, back to the story. He'd received 3 complaints in the last month. Anonymous messages routed through customer feedback forms and quietly confirmed by a few trusted sources, alleging that staff at this location treated some customers differently. The kind of different that came from seeing color before credentials. Elijah had built his business from nothing, rising from a single used car lot in Atlanta to a national name in luxury vehicles. He prided himself on inclusivity, on creating opportunity and dignity in an industry where perception often trumped substance. And now, the reputation he'd worked a lifetime to build was being tarnished by a few careless employees with dangerous assumptions. He turned off the engine, exhaled slowly, and stepped into the crisp morning air. The difference was immediate. As he walked toward the dealership, a greeter glanced his way, paused, then turned toward a man in a blazer who'd just parked a BMW. Elijah continued on without acknowledgement, noting every expression, every flicker of judgment in passing glances. Inside, the space gleamed with modern opulence. Leather couches, brushed steel fixtures, a coffee bar with espresso options no one really drank. But what stood out most was who got the attention and who didn't. He moved toward a glossy black luxury coupe, its price tag north of 6 figures. He placed a hand on the mirror, admiring the design. And that's when he heard it. "Hey, pal," a voice behind him said. "You lost? These cars aren't for looking. They're for buying. And something tells me you're in the wrong place." Elijah didn't flinch. He just smiled faintly. The test had begun. Elijah stepped off the dealership's polished entrance, blending into the morning bustle with deliberate ease. In place of crisp suits and polished shoes, he now wore a faded navy jacket over an old, comfortable tee and worn denim, a disguise that softened his commanding presence without masking the observant gleam in his eyes. Every detail, from the frayed cuff of his sleeves to the scuffed sneakers on his feet, was chosen to dismantle his familiar image of corporate authority. Today, he was simply another face in the crowd, unnoticed and unremarkable. As he walked along the parking lot, he mentally rehearsed his plan. His purpose was clear: to experience in real time the treatment of customers who, by all appearances, did not fit the usual mold. He recalled the complaints, vague yet troubling allegations of discrimination and condescension. The stakes were high, for the reputation of Grant Motors, a beacon of luxury and progress, now rested on the honesty of its staff. Elijah felt the weight of his responsibilities, not as a CEO behind closed doors, but as a silent witness among the very people his company was meant to serve. He made small talk with a few service members and fellow visitors, noting who was greeted with warmth and who was overlooked. The dealership's sleek, almost sterile opulence seemed at odds with the authenticity he sought. His heart was in the right place. He wanted to uncover the truth behind every dismissive smile and unreturned glance. With every step, the dichotomy between his public persona and the man hidden behind the disguise stirred within him a bittersweet resolve. Elijah paused by a modest sedan parked in a less conspicuous part of the lot, his mind reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. From the humbler beginnings of his own struggles to the boardroom battles he now fought silently. In that quiet moment, his purpose crystallized. No longer shielded by corporate power, he was here to ensure every customer, regardless of appearance, was treated with the dignity he believed in so fiercely. The undercover test had just begun, and he was determined to let truth steer the future of his company. The doors hissed open with a soft whoosh as Elijah stepped into the pristine expanse of the Grant Motors showroom. The scent of fresh leather and polished chrome hung in the air, mingling with the faint hum of ambient jazz spilling softly from hidden speakers. The dealership was every bit the crown jewel he'd designed it to be. Sleek glass partitions, luxury models angled like works of art, and a service desk that resembled a concierge lounge more than a sales floor. But beneath the shine, Elijah wasn't here to admire aesthetics. He was watching. He strolled casually, his hand brushing the hood of a deep crimson sports coupe, then moving on to a sleek electric SUV with custom chrome rims. A few salespeople milled about in their blazers and polished smiles, chatting with customers dressed in business attire or designer sweats. No one approached him. He passed two salesmen who barely glanced his way, one of them looking over his shoulder before turning back to a man in loafers holding a car magazine. Minutes passed. Elijah wandered deeper into the showroom, pausing with studied interest at the new Vantage Edition hybrid. Still, no one came. It wasn't until he made a slow circle back toward the main counter that a pair of eyes finally locked onto him. Bored, slightly annoyed eyes belonging to a salesman with perfectly styled hair and a Rolex that gleamed with calculated intent. Todd Halpern. Elijah had read the name on more than one glowing monthly report. Top earner, high close ratio, favored by big-ticket clients. But reputation, he knew, was a poor substitute for character. Todd sauntered over, his smile tight and practiced, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Looking for something specific?" he asked, giving Elijah a once-over that lingered on the worn hoodie and sneakers. Elijah met his gaze, calm and unshaken. "Thinking about a test drive." Todd raised an eyebrow, his smirk twitching at the corners. "Of that," he nodded toward the luxury coupe Elijah had admired earlier. "Not sure that model's worth your time, unless you're shopping for someone else." The line was drawn. Elijah didn't blink. "No," he said evenly. "It's for me." Todd chuckled. "Right." Todd Halpern adjusted his cufflinks as if the simple act of speaking to Elijah had wrinkled his sleeves. His eyes, pale blue and impatient, scanned the showroom floor as though searching for a more lucrative prospect. Elijah could feel the calculation happening in real time. This guy didn't see a customer, he saw a profile. And Elijah, in Todd's mind, didn't fit the image of someone serious. "You know," Todd said with an easy, patronizing tone, "we usually require proof of financing before offering test drives in our luxury line. Just part of our policy. Weed out the window shoppers, you understand." Elijah offered a polite smile. "Do you apply that policy to everyone?" Todd's smile tightened. "Everyone who walks in without an appointment, sure." Elijah caught the shift. "Not everyone. Just the ones who don't look the part." Todd stepped back, motioning vaguely toward a modest crossover near the back. "If you're serious about buying something today, maybe we start with one of our certified pre-owned models. Plenty of solid options under 30 grand. Lower insurance, too." Elijah folded his arms casually. "I didn't ask for lower insurance." "Of course not," Todd said, backpedaling slightly, but his tone still dripped with condescension. "Look, I'm just trying to be helpful. Guys in your position, you don't want to bite off more than you can chew." It took everything in Elijah not to laugh at the irony. "My position," he repeated softly. "And what position is that exactly?" Todd didn't answer right away. He glanced again at Elijah's clothes, the shoes, the aging car he'd seen pull up. "No offense, man," he said, shrugging. "But we've got a lot of people coming in here just to feel the leather, take pictures for the gram. You wouldn't believe how many think test drive means free joyride. I've got real buyers waiting." Elijah nodded, slow and deliberate. "I see." Todd clapped his hands once, as if wrapping up the conversation. "If you change your mind and bring proof of funds, maybe we'll talk. Until then," he gestured toward the exit with a smirk. "Thanks for stopping by." Elijah smiled faintly, his voice calm. "Oh, I'll be back. I promise." Elijah stood there a moment longer, letting the silence stretch between them. Todd had already turned his back, walking away with the confident swagger of someone who believed he'd successfully swatted away a nuisance. Elijah didn't follow. He simply watched, taking in every detail. The way Todd immediately approached a man in a tailored suit near the financing desk, his whole demeanor shifting like a switch flipped. smiling, engaged, attentive. The contrast was jarring, but not surprising. Around him, the showroom bustled with selective energy. A young couple was being offered espresso by another salesman, while an older gentleman in golf attire was already being walked out to the parking lot for a test drive. Elijah, meanwhile, remained invisible, unacknowledged, discounted. He turned slowly, walking back toward the entrance. A receptionist gave him a cursory glance, but didn't speak. Another salesman leaned on a counter, eyes flicking over Elijah before returning to his phone. The message was loud without needing to be said. You don't belong here. Outside, the sun had risen higher, casting long shadows across the pristine vehicles parked out front. Elijah paused beside the luxury coupe he'd been admiring earlier. Its glossy black finish mirrored his reflection. Casual, anonymous, forgettable. Just how he'd planned it. What Todd had failed to understand, however, was that under the hoodie and worn sneakers stood the man who signed his paychecks. Elijah opened the door of his old Accord and sank into the seat, the cushion sighing beneath him. He let out a slow breath, not of defeat, but of focus. His hands rested on the wheel, fingers tapping a rhythm only he knew. Then he reached into the glove box and pulled out his phone. A single call. I need all interior footage from the Midtown location, he said once the line connected. And the audio, too. Everything starting 30 minutes before now. Yes, discreetly. Send it to my private server. He hung up, tucked the phone away, and looked back at the dealership through the windshield. Todd had made a mistake. But Elijah wasn't angry. He was awake. And now, the real work would begin. Inside the dealership, Todd strutted across the showroom floor like a man who had just scored a small but satisfying victory. He leaned against the reception desk, spinning his key fob around his index finger as he chatted with a colleague, Miles, another veteran on the floor. His voice carried just enough to be overheard. Guy walks in here looking like he just came from a bus stop, Todd said with a smirk, and wants to test drive the Vantage? Come on. Miles chuckled. You serious? Dead serious. Hoodie, old sneakers, maybe $40 in his bank account if he's lucky. Probably figured he could post a TikTok sitting in the driver's seat and pretend he's made it. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't care who heard. The receptionist gave a nervous laugh, but quickly looked away, clearly uncomfortable. Another staff member lingered a little longer than necessary by a nearby desk, her lips pressed tightly together. Todd continued, emboldened. I've been in this business 10 years. I know the type. Talk a big game, then disappear when it's time to show a credit score. Look, he gestured vaguely toward the entrance. If you don't dress the part, don't expect to be treated like a real buyer. That's not discrimination. That's common sense. But something in his tone had shifted. It wasn't just arrogance now. It was entitlement, seasoned with the kind of casual bias that becomes most dangerous when left unchecked. There was no shame, no doubt, just the smug conviction of someone who believed his assumptions were facts. Meanwhile, Elijah sat in his car, still parked discreetly across the street. He hadn't left yet. Instead, he watched as Todd reappeared in the glass-walled lobby, still talking, still laughing. And that was when Elijah saw it, the exact moment Todd looked up, noticed the car, still idling outside, and frowned. There was no recognition, not yet. Just confusion, a wrinkle of irritation. But Elijah was already dialing. Give me a meeting with the board, he said, today, and prep the dealership footage for review. He wasn't just documenting a problem anymore. He was preparing for impact. It started small, just a few curious glances exchanged near the service lounge, whispers behind coffee cups as customers picked up on the tension. The commotion from earlier hadn't gone entirely unnoticed. A woman in a tailored blazer nudged her husband as they passed the front desk. Did you hear what that salesman said to that guy in the hoodie? She whispered. He didn't even give him a brochure. Nearby, a teenage boy scrolling through his phone quietly replayed the moment he'd caught on video. The short exchange between Todd and the man in the hoodie, the smirk, the condescending tone. He didn't meant to film it, really. It was just something he did now and then, capturing awkward public moments. But something about this one had stuck. The arrogance. The way the man had stood there, quiet but not defeated. He uploaded the clip with a caption. This salesman just profiled the guy for wearing sneakers. But he regrets it. The post began to circulate. Inside the dealership, Todd remained oblivious, still caught up in his own performance. He hadn't noticed the side eyes or the subtle shift in atmosphere, but others were beginning to. A woman waiting in the financing office leaned over to an employee and said, "That guy, Todd, he just talked down to that customer like he didn't matter." It was disgusting. Employees were beginning to talk too. Quietly at first. One of the service technicians muttered to another, "That guy Todd embarrassed? He didn't look like some random kid. He moved like someone who's used to being in charge." The energy in the showroom grew heavier, more watchful. Staff became more cautious with their words. Customers lingered, less interested in browsing, more interested in watching the floor unfold like a live show. Then the front door opened again. Elijah had returned, this time not inside. He stood just outside the dealership's wide glass entrance, arms crossed, observing. Still dressed in his hoodie and jeans. Still quiet. Only now, the crowd noticed him too. And for the first time, so did Todd, whose smirk began to falter as the air shifted, the room turned, and the weight of scrutiny settled squarely on his shoulders. Elijah didn't stay long. He stood in the doorway for just a moment, taking in the scene before him. The glossy showroom, the manufactured smiles, and now, the growing quiet that rippled outward like a drop in still water. Conversations that had once buzzed with casual excitement now fell to a hush. Every eye was subtly drawn to him, not out of recognition, but curiosity. A few people shifted uncomfortably. A child asked aloud, "Is that the man the salesman yelled at?" Todd saw him too. Their eyes met across the floor. Elijah held the gaze, steady and unreadable. There was no anger in his expression, no dramatic flourish. Just a calm that unnerved Todd far more than shouting ever could. Todd blinked, his cocky posture stiffening, then turned abruptly and busied himself with a clipboard he didn't need, pretending to check inventory that didn't matter. Elijah turned and walked out. No confrontación, no declaración, just quiet purpose. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly, tugging at the edges of Elijah's jacket as he crossed the lot. He reached his car and paused at the door, glancing back once, not at the building, but at the people inside it. Some were still watching. Some looked away, unsure what they'd just witnessed. A few, like the receptionist and one of the junior sales associates, looked ashamed. He slid into the driver's seat, shut the door, and exhaled. The air inside the car felt warmer, quieter. He sat in it for a long moment, letting the silence settle over him like armor. Then he took out his phone and tapped a save number. "It's time," he said when the voice on the other end answered. "Schedule the board meeting for tonight. Full team. I want the regional managers on, too. And start drafting a press response. Something authentic, not polished." "Understood," the voice said. "You want me to include PR and legal?" "No," Elijah replied, eyes still on the glass-wrapped building. "Not yet. This isn't about damage control. It's about doing what's right." He ended the call, set the phone down, and finally started the engine. The test was over. Now came the lesson. Back in his office, tucked high above the city in the Grant Motors corporate tower, Elijah watched the footage unfold in silence. The dealership's security team had been swift. Every camera angle, every microphone feed from the Midtown location had been pulled, time-stamped, and sent to his secure server. The footage arrived raw. No cuts, no edits, just the unvarnished truth laid bare in frame after frame. He leaned forward, eyes scanning the screen as the video began. The showroom entrance, a quiet figure in a hoodie stepping through the automatic doors. Him. He watched himself move through the space unnoticed, watched as employees passed him like air, their smiles reserved for others. Then came Todd. The angle from above caught the entire exchange. Todd's posture, loose, dismissive. The way he looked Elijah up and down before delivering his line like a punch. "You lost? These cars aren't for looking. They're for buying." Elijah hit pause. He stared at the still image, not in shock, but in reflection. He'd heard it, lived it, but now, seeing it from the outside, it landed differently. Sharper. The look in Todd's eyes wasn't just arrogance. It was certainty. Certainty that a man like Elijah didn't belong near a car like that. He resumed the video. It rolled through every word, every sneer, every smirk. The commentary to Miles. The laughter. The casual cruelty passed off as company policy. And in the background, customers watching, some silent, some uneasy, and a few disturbingly entertained. Elijah didn't flinch. When the video ended, he sat back and pulled up the second file, audio logs. Microphones near the service counter had picked up even more than cameras had caught. Conversations where Todd and others spoke freely, sometimes crudely, about the kind of clients they preferred and the ones they didn't. The ones who didn't look the part. He closed the laptop softly, fingers steepled under his chin. The proof was irrefutable. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a rot that had been allowed to grow under the surface of his company's success. He had what he needed. Tomorrow, the truth would not be hidden behind a suit, a smile, or a showroom window. Tomorrow, the truth would speak. Todd Halpern sat in his usual corner of the dealership break room, a paper cup of burnt coffee in one hand and his phone in the other, scrolling through car memes and group chats that did little to distract him from the nagging discomfort in the pit of his stomach. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. Something about that guy, the one in the hoodie with the calm eyes and the quiet defiance, had stuck with him. Not because he'd felt guilty. Not exactly. Todd prided himself on reading people, on knowing who was a real buyer and who was just there to waste his time. That was how you stayed at the top of the board. Efficiency, precision, salesmanship, and if he had to ruffle a few egos along the way, so be it. But something about the way that guy looked at him, not angry, not defensive, just sure, like he knew something Todd didn't, like the punchline hadn't landed yet. Todd shook his head and went back to scrolling. Someone had sent a TikTok link. He tapped it, half interested, and nearly choked on his coffee. There he was, on screen, Todd Halpern, professional closer, smirking in high definition as he gestured vaguely toward the door and dismissed the man in the hoodie. The caption read, "When your sales guy forgets who signs the checks." The clip had already racked up tens of thousands of views. Jesus, Todd muttered under his breath. His finger hovered over the screen before tapping through the comments. Most were brutal. He really said bring proof of funds with his whole chest. Bro's about to be selling mopeds. Plot twist, that guy owns the dealership. Todd laughed nervously, but his face felt hot. He looked around. Had anyone else seen this? Had corporate? He stood up quickly, his coffee sloshing, and left the break room without saying a word. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe it would blow over. But deep down, a flicker of fear had begun to take root, because Todd was starting to realize that he hadn't just disrespected a customer. He'd underestimated the wrong man. The executive boardroom on the 34th floor of Grant Motors corporate headquarters was a sleek, glass-walled sanctuary of power. A polished mahogany table stretched the length of the room, surrounded by leather chairs that whispered wealth with every shift. The windows offered a sweeping view of the skyline, but no one was admiring it this morning. Elijah stood at the head of the table, his laptop open, a remote in hand. The air was still, thick with anticipation. Around him sat 12 board members, executives, department heads, and regional directors, each of them watching him closely, most unaware of what had brought them here on such short notice. He clicked the remote. The screen behind him flickered to life. A still frame appeared, Todd Halpern, mid-gesture, mouth open, that smug smile frozen in time. Next to him, Elijah in his hoodie, arms crossed, silent. "This," Elijah began, "is one of our top salesmen at the Midtown dealership. Yesterday, I visited the showroom unannounced and dressed like an average customer. I wasn't greeted. I wasn't offered assistance. I was profiled. Then, I was dismissed. A few members shifted in their seats." He clicked again. The video played. The full exchange. Todd's voice filled the room. Sarcastic, condescending, loud enough to hear the laughter in his tone. When the clip ended, Elijah paused, then played the second. Audio from the break room. Todd mocking the interaction, bragging about sending time-wasters packing. When the last recording faded, the room was silent. Then came the whispers. A marketing exec rubbed her temples. One of the regional directors muttered, "Jesus Christ." The VP of sales leaned forward, face pale. "Do we know how far this has spread?" someone asked. "It's viral," Elijah said. "Over 500,000 views." It's already being picked up by news aggregators. Another click. Charts now, customer trust indexes, social sentiment tracking, projected fallout. We can fire him, someone said quickly. Issue a press release. Distance ourselves. Elijah raised a hand. No. The board went quiet. We don't sweep this under the rug. We don't just save face. We fix the culture that let this happen. He let the silence settle before finishing. This isn't a scandal. It's a mirror. The silence that followed Elijah's final words wasn't passive. It was weighty, uncomfortable, alive with unspoken thoughts as the board members processed the reality they'd just been handed. No one argued that the behavior wasn't inexcusable. But behind the nods and murmurs of agreement, Elijah could sense the tension. The reflexive instinct to protect the brand, to shield themselves from public scrutiny rather than address the root cause. Well, said Claire Maddox, VP of Marketing, finally breaking the quiet. This is horrifying, but it's also salvageable. We act fast, fire the salesman, issue a statement condemning the behavior, emphasize that it's an isolated incident. We control the narrative. No, Elijah said firmly. We don't pretend this is isolated. We take responsibility, even if it damages the brand? Asked Richard Hale, CFO, his fingers steepled tightly. Our stock price dropped 3 points overnight. If this grows, it could affect investor confidence. Our shareholders aren't going to care about moral high ground if they see losses. Elijah met his gaze without flinching. Then maybe we need better shareholders. That silenced Richard. I won't build this company on a foundation of silence and spin. Elijah continued. We say we value integrity. It's time we prove it. We go public, but not with a sanitized press release. With the full story. What happened? Why it happened? And what we're going to do to make sure it never happens again. Murmurs rippled through the room again, this time with more weight behind them. A few faces shifted from concern to something closer to resolve. You want to make it a teachable moment, Claire said, quietly now, thoughtful. A real one. Yes, Elijah said. I want to make sure the next person who walks into one of our showrooms, whether they're in a suit or a hoodie, is seen, respected, valued. From the corner, Devin Pierce, the quietly observant head of HR, finally spoke. Then we don't just fire one man. We change everything, training, hiring, policy. From the inside out. Elijah nodded. Exactly. Around the table, heads began to nod, slowly at first, then with conviction. The tide was shifting, not toward containment, toward transformation. By the end of the meeting, the mood in the boardroom had changed from damage control to determination. The easy route, quiet termination, corporate apology, a promise to do better, had been rejected. Elijah had made sure of that. What they needed wasn't a fix. It was a reckoning. The team stayed late, gathered around whiteboards and tablets, brainstorming in bursts of tense energy and thoughtful silence. Devin Pierce took point on internal reform, already outlining a new company-wide training initiative, one rooted not in basic customer service scripts, but in active anti-bias education. Every employee, from sales associate to senior executive, would be required to complete it quarterly. Performance bonuses would be tied not just to sales numbers, but to customer feedback scores and inclusivity metrics. Claire worked with the PR team to develop a transparent, human-forward media plan. No defensiveness. No hiding behind legalese. They would own their failure and share the plan to fix it in detail. The announcement would be delivered not by a spokesperson, but by Elijah himself, through a live video statement posted to the company's platforms and syndicated to major outlets. It has to be raw, Elijah said. No teleprompters. No polish. Just truth. On the operations side, the regional directors pulled together a list of dealerships for immediate review, starting with Midtown. Surprise audits, anonymous shopper visits, and customer follow-up calls would begin that week. Those who passed would be elevated as models. Those who didn't would face mandatory retraining or full leadership restructuring. What about Todd? Someone finally asked, quieter than the rest. Elijah paused. He'd been thinking about that too. We give him a choice, he said. He can resign and walk away. Or he can come in, sit down with me, watch the footage himself, and hear how his actions affected more than just me. Then we'll decide. There was no triumph in his voice, only clarity. By midnight, the plan was mapped. Not just to respond, but to evolve. To become the kind of company Elijah had always envisioned. One where equity wasn't just a slogan, but a standard. Change had begun. And this time, it would not be superficial. The following morning, the Midtown dealership was unusually quiet for opening hour. Word had spread, internally at least, that something was coming. Staff moved with an edge of nervous energy. Conversations clipped and uncertain. Todd arrived late, blaming traffic as usual, but even he could feel the shift. Colleagues gave him wide berth. No jokes, no greetings, just silence. Then, at precisely 9 a.m., a luxury black sedan rolled into the front lot, its glossy frame catching the morning sun like polished obsidian. It was one of the company's flagship models, the kind reserved for major events or top-tier buyers. When the driver stepped out and opened the back door, heads turned. Elijah emerged. No hoodie, no school-fit sneakers. He wore a tailored navy suit, crisp white shirt, no tie, business casual, but unmistakably authoritative. As he walked toward the glass doors, a hush fell over the floor. The same feet that had been ignored just days earlier now echoed against polished tile with quiet command. Todd froze behind the counter, heart pounding as he recognized the face. Elijah stepped into the showroom and paused. His eyes scanned the space with practiced calm. He greeted no one at first, just walked, slowly, deliberately, past the same coupe he'd been denied a test drive in, past the espresso machine, past the corner where Todd had once joked about time wasters. He stopped only when he reached the center of the room. "I'm Elijah Grant," he said aloud, his voice cutting clean through the silence. "Owner and CEO of Grant Motors." Mouths dropped. A few gasps escaped. Even the receptionist, who'd greeted him with indifference days before, now looked like she might faint. "I was here 3 days ago," he continued. "I came in dressed differently. I wasn't recognized, and that was the point. I wanted to see how our customers are treated when we don't think they matter." His gaze settled on Todd, who visibly shrank behind the desk. "And what I saw," Elijah said, "was unacceptable." No anger in his tone, no raised voice, just the quiet weight of truth. It hung heavy in the air, heavier than any lecture or threat. And it was only the beginning. Todd felt the room closing in around him. Each second that passed under Elijah's steady gaze felt longer than the last. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken judgment, full of eyes that had watched him strut through the showroom day after day with unchecked arrogance. Now they watched him shrink. Elijah didn't point. He didn't call Todd by name. He didn't need to. I was offered nothing. Not a greeting. Not question. Not a moment of consideration. Elijah continued, his voice low but resonant. "Because I didn't look the part. Because assumptions were made. A few employees shifted uncomfortably, some looking toward Todd, others downward. Even those who hadn't been involved in the incident felt the sting of complicity." Elijah looked around the showroom slowly. You never know who's watching. More importantly, you never know who you're speaking to. Every person who walks through that door, whether they're wearing a suit, a hoodie, or a uniform, deserves respect. Todd took a half step forward, as if to speak, but hesitated. The words died in his throat. What would he possibly say? Elijah turned his attention toward the general manager. Effective immediately, the Midtown location is undergoing a complete review. Customer service protocols, training, leadership, everything. And I'll be overseeing it myself. The manager nodded quickly, visibly rattled. Then at last, Elijah looked directly at Todd. "You have a decision to make," he said. "You can resign, or you can meet me in the conference room this afternoon, watch the footage with me, and hear how your words affected more than just one man. But you'll be held accountable, one way or another." Todd's face flushed. For the first time in years, the confidence was gone. The smirk replaced with something far less familiar: regret. Elijah didn't wait for an answer. He turned and began walking toward the exit, the room parting in silence as he passed. Just before stepping outside, he paused and looked back. "This place is about to change," he said simply. "Decide now if you're ready to be part of that." Then he walked into the daylight, leaving the truth and its consequences behind him. The conference room felt colder than usual, despite the sunlight streaming in through the tall windows. Todd sat alone at the long glass table, fingers twitching slightly against the cool surface, a bottle of water untouched beside him. He'd chosen to stay. Pride, fear, maybe something deeper had brought him here. But now, seated across from the man he'd humiliated just days ago, Todd realized nothing could prepare him for the weight of this moment. Elijah entered without fanfare. He didn't bring assistance or legal counsel, just his laptop and the calm, focused energy of someone who'd already made peace with what needed to be done. He sat across from Todd and opened the screen. The silence between them stretched for a long beat before Elijah finally spoke. "You ready to see it?" he asked. Todd swallowed and nodded. Elijah pressed play. The footage rolled. The showroom. The entrance. Todd's voice, casual and cutting. The smirk. The dismissal. The laughter with Miles afterward. Todd watched himself with growing discomfort, as if seeing a stranger were his face. The smug tone. The way he gestured. The way he talked about Elijah like he wasn't even a person. Then came the break room audio. His voice again, mocking, crude. Jokes that weren't jokes. Judgments that now sounded childish and mean-spirited. By the time the final clip faded, the room felt like it had lost all its oxygen. Todd finally spoke. I didn't know who you were." "That's the problem," Elijah said quietly. "It shouldn't have mattered." Todd looked down. The bravado had long since drained from him. "I've worked here for years. I've hit every sales goal, closed every quarter strong. I thought I understood people." "No," Elijah said calmly. "You learned how to sell to people who look like you. That's not understanding. That's pattern recognition. There's no skill in seeing value only when it's obvious." Todd's voice cracked. "I was wrong." "Yes," Elijah said, "but the apology isn't for me alone. It's for every customer who's ever walked into this dealership and left feeling small. You don't owe me an apology, Todd. You owe them one." And for once, Todd had no argument left. Todd stared at the blank screen long after the footage ended, the final echoes of his own voice still ringing in his ears. The silence that followed was heavier than any reprimand he'd ever received. He had nothing left to hide behind, no policies to cite, no excuses to lean on. The truth had played out in high definition, and it was uglier than he'd ever imagined. Elijah didn't press him. He didn't need to. The evidence had already spoken. "I didn't realize how I sounded," Todd finally said, voice low. "It was just how he talked sometimes. Locker room stuff. Jokes." "They weren't jokes," Elijah replied evenly. "They were weapons. You used them to dismiss people, to cut them down before they had a chance to prove you wrong." Todd nodded slowly, his eyes downcast. "I thought I was just filtering out the time wasters." "No," Elijah said. "You were filtering out humanity." The words landed hard. Todd closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to retreat from them, but there was no shelter left. He had been exposed by the footage, by his peers, and by his own reflection. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "Not from you, not from anyone, but want to do better. I don't want this to be who I am." Elijah studied him, not with contempt, but with an intensity that made Todd's skin prickle. "Then understand this. It's not enough to regret what you've done. You have to take responsibility for the harm. You have to unlearn every instinct that made you think what you did was normal." Todd nodded again, slowly. "What happens now?" "That's up to you," Elijah said. "You can walk out of here, pretend it was just a bad week, and disappear. Or you can stay, publicly acknowledge what you did, and help us build something better. Not because it saved your job, but because it starts to make amends." Todd looked up, eyes raw. "You let me stay?" Elijah didn't smile. "I let you earn your place back. But there won't be shortcuts. No more excuses. This time you walk the hard road." And Todd, for the first time in years, felt the weight of real choice. The next morning, the Midtown dealership opened with a different kind of tension in the air. Employees gathered near the showroom floor, curious and wary. Word had spread quickly. Something was happening, and it wasn't going to be quiet. Elijah stood near the center of the dealership again, dressed sharply but simply, no entourage in sight. He wasn't here to grandstand. He was here to witness. Todd emerged from the back office, his usual confident stride replaced by something slower, more deliberate. He looked around at the faces, his co-workers, the receptionist he'd once ignored, the service team he'd rarely spoken to, and a few early customers who stood by watching, puzzled. Then his eyes met Elijah's, and he gave a single nod. He stepped forward and cleared his throat. "I want to say something," he began, voice tight but clear. "Actually, I need to say something." People paused mid-task. Conversations fell away. 3 days ago, I disrespected a customer who came into this showroom. I judged him based on how he looked, and I spoke to him with condescension, with arrogance, and with prejudice. I didn't know who he was, but that shouldn't have mattered. Todd glanced at Elijah again, then back to the room. "I've been here for years, and I thought I understood people. But the truth is, I was only ever seeing the ones who looked like me, talked like me, dressed the way I expected. Everyone else, I dismissed." He let the silence linger. It wasn't just for effect. It was to sit in the discomfort he'd created. "I embarrassed this company. I embarrassed myself. And worse, I probably made others feel unwelcome here long before this moment ever went viral. To anyone I've hurt, colleagues, customers, even those I didn't realize I offended, I'm sorry. No qualifications. No explanations. Just, I'm sorry." The room was quiet, but it wasn't cold. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Todd said. "I'm asking for a chance to earn back your trust. I'll be staying on, not because I was spared, but because I chose to take responsibility. I'll be doing the work. And if you see me slip again, call me out. I want to be better." He stepped back, quiet now, exposed but no longer ashamed. Elijah watched the room with careful eyes as Todd stepped back into the crowd, shoulders tense, hands loosely clasped. The silence that followed was not the awkward kind. It was reflective. Heavy. But slowly, a few quiet nods emerged. A receptionist gave a small, supportive clap. One of the service techs, normally stone-faced, folded his arms and murmured, "Took guts." Elijah stepped forward, addressing not just the employees, but the small group of customers who had paused their appointments to listen. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "What you witnessed just now wasn't about humiliation," he said. "It wasn't about punishment. It was about accountability, growth, and the uncomfortable truth that even in a place like this, one built on values I thought we all shared, bias still find a way to hide." People leaned in, some standing straighter, others folding their arms, listening. "This company was born out of struggle," Elijah continued. "Out of being underestimated, out of being told I didn't belong in boardrooms, that I wasn't the type to succeed. So when someone walks into one of my showrooms and is judged before they speak, I take that personally." He let that truth hang in the air, then soften his tone. "But what matters most isn't the mistake. It's what comes after. What you choose to do when you're faced with your own reflection and you don't like what you see." He gestured to Todd, who stood quietly among his peers. He chose to stay, to own it. That's the beginning. But can't stop with him. Every person in this building has a responsibility, because culture doesn't change from policy memos. It changes from the ground up. One conversation, one choice, one act of respect at a time. There was a hush, broken only by the low hum of traffic outside the dealership's glass walls. "We're not perfect," Elijah said finally. "But from today forward, we're going to be honest. We're going to be better. And if we do it right, this won't be a scandal we survived. It'll be a moment that defined who we chose to become." And with that, he stepped back, allowing the weight of the moment to settle not just on their shoulders, but into their hearts. Within 48 hours, Grant Motors issued a statement unlike any the industry had seen. It wasn't polished to a sterile gleam by lawyers or softened by PR consultants. It was real, personal, direct, and signed by Elijah Grant himself. It began with an admission. "We failed. Not just one customer, but many. And we're not going to hide behind silence or shame. We're going to change." The statement included the entire incident, not just the confrontation, but the context. It acknowledged the role bias plays in the retail experience, the pain it causes, and the responsibility companies have to confront it. It outlined immediate steps. The launch of a new initiative called Respect in Every Room, a company-wide transformation designed to root out systemic bias from hiring to service and to rebuild the culture from the inside out. Mandatory training wouldn't be relegated to onboarding paperwork anymore. It would be immersive, recurring, and deeply tied to real-world stories, including the one that had just unfolded. Frontline staff would be required to participate in live forums, role-playing sessions, and anonymous case studies, some of which would be based on footage from Elijah's own undercover visit. Performance reviews would now include empathy and equity metrics, weighted equally alongside sales numbers and customer retention. Managers would undergo certification through third-party organizations to ensure training wasn't just performative, but transformative. Perhaps most radically, Grant Motors announced the creation of a customer experience oversight board, a diverse, rotating panel of customers, employees, and independent advocates who would review complaints, investigate reports of profiling, and make binding recommendations. The announcement went viral within hours, not just because of the controversy, but because of the clarity and courage of its message. Media outlets praised the transparency. Activists shared it as a blueprint for corporate accountability. Customers flooded comment sections with their own experiences, some angry, others hopeful. Internally, it sent a different kind of message, one that said, "The old way is over." From this moment on, dignity wasn't just a nice idea. It was policy, and every person, whether employee, customer, or stranger, deserved to feel the moment they walked through the door. By the end of the week, the atmosphere inside the Midtown dealership had shifted. Not in the way that comes from a scandal fading into memory, but in the quiet, slow-burning way that real change begins. The staff spoke more carefully, but not out of fear, out of awareness, out of something close to respect. It was as if the walls themselves had absorbed the lesson and were now demanding better of everyone who walked beneath them. On Friday morning, Elijah returned, but this time he wasn't there to address the staff or review policies. He was there to introduce someone. Jamila Rhodes stepped into the showroom behind him, poised and composed in a navy blue blazer, her natural curls pinned back, her eyes scanning the space with a quiet confidence. She had spent the last 4 years behind the service desk, organizing schedules, managing appointments, solving problems others passed off, and doing it all with grace that had often gone unnoticed by the people above her. But Elijah had noticed. "Some of you know Jamila already," he said to the gathered employees, his voice carrying a warmth that settled nerves. "You've seen her stay late to help a stranded customer. You've watched her smooth out a dozen mistakes she didn't cause. What you may not have seen is her leadership." He turned to Jamila, which is why, starting today, she'll be stepping into the role of assistant sales director here at Midtown. There was a pause, a flicker of surprise from some, a smile from others. Jamila looked around at her coworkers, some of whom had never seen her outside her usual post behind the desk. She met each gaze without flinching. "I'm here because I believe in what this place can be," she said. "Not what it's been. I know what it's like to be overlooked, and I know what it means to be seen. From now on, we're making sure every customer, every employee is seen." There was something quiet but unshakable in her voice. And as the team clapped, Elijah watched from the side, knowing this was exactly the kind of leadership his company had needed all along. Someone who'd lived the lesson and now was ready to teach it. The response from the public came swiftly, and it didn't arrive in silence. It came with voices. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Some outraged by the initial offense. Others inspired by the clarity of the response. But most of all, people were talking because, for once, a company hadn't tried to spin its way out of wrongdoing. It had faced the mirror and turned it toward the world. In the days that followed Elijah's statement and Todd's public apology, comments poured in from every corner of the country. A viral thread on social media, written by a young man who'd once been turned away at a Grant Motors location because he was just browsing, gained traction quickly. But instead of calling for boycotts, he wrote, "This time they didn't hide. This time they listened." News outlets picked up the story again. Only now the tone had changed. What started as a corporate misstep had evolved into something else entirely. National morning shows featured Elijah's approach as a masterclass in accountability. Editorials debated whether this marked a turning point in corporate responsibility. Civil rights groups reached out, offering partnership instead of protest.